My name is Lucille Anderson, 54 years old, and I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who'd resort to revenge. For 28 years, I was the trusting wife who looked the other way when things didn't add up. That all changed the day I was cleaning Frank's car and found a tube of lubricant hidden under the driver's seat. I didn't confront him. I didn't cry. I simply replaced it with industrial strength glue and waited. What happened next involved firefighters, an emergency room, and the most humiliating night of my husband's life. I'd love to know where you're watching from today. If you think what I did was justified, hit that like button and subscribe to hear how the glue that separated us physically ultimately set me free emotionally. Frank and I grew up in Oak Ridge, Missouri, a town so small that everyone not only knows your name, but also your business favorite breakfast cereal and who you took to senior prom. In my case, that was Frank Anderson, the boy I married 2 months after high school graduation in 1988. We were 18 and stupidly in love with big dreams and small bank accounts. Our early years weren't easy. Frank worked at his uncle's insurance agency while taking night classes in business. I waitressed at the local diner and later found work as an assistant at the public library. We lived in a tiny one-bedroom apartment above the hardware store on Main Street, saving every penny for a down payment on a real home. When I got pregnant with our son Daniel at 23, we were terrified but thrilled. Emma followed 2 years later, completing our family. Frank eventually worked his way up to become a partner at Anderson Miller Insurance, now the largest agency in 3 counties. I earned my degree in library science through correspondence courses and secured a position as the elementary school librarian. We bought a modest 3-bedroom ranch house on Maple Street when the kids were small, and 20 years later, we were still there though. We'd remodeled the kitchen and added a deck out back. Our lives settled into comfortable predictability. Friday night dinners at Lorenzo's Italian restaurant. Saturday mornings spent on yard work and errands. Sunday services at First Baptist, followed by brunch with the Millers or the Johnsons. It wasn't exciting, but it was ours, and I was content. The kids grew up and moved away. Daniel to Chicago for a job in finance, Emma to Denver, where she taught high school English. Our house felt too quiet sometimes, but Frank and I found new rhythms. I joined a book club and volunteered at the animal shelter. Frank played golf with clients and served on the Chamber of Commerce board. We were that couple everyone in town thought would grow old together on rocking chairs on our front porch. For our 28th anniversary last October, Frank took me to the new upscale restaurant in Springfield, a 40-minute drive from home. He wore his good suit and even bought me flowers, something he hadn't done in years. But throughout dinner, he seemed distracted checking his phone under the table when he thought I wouldn't notice. When the waiter asked if we were celebrating anything special, Frank looked momentarily confused before remembering. "Anniversary," he said, not meeting my eyes. I told myself he was just stressed about work. The Peterson account was causing problems, and the Miller brothers were threatening to take their business elsewhere. That's what I wanted to believe anyway. There had been other signs I'd ignored. Frank had started going to the gym 3 times a week after decades of claiming exercise was for people with something to prove. He bought new underwear without being prompted. His standard aftershave was replaced with something more expensive. And most tellingly, his phone was suddenly password protected after years of leaving it carelessly on countertops. "Privacy's important these days," he said when I casually mentioned it. "Too many scammers can access your information." I nodded, as if that made perfect sense, though a small voice in my head whispered that the only information he was protecting had nothing to do with scammers. Still, 28 years of marriage had taught me that trust was fundamental. I refused to be that suspicious wife who snoops through drawers and demands to see text messages. At least that's what I told myself before I found the lubricant. Every Saturday morning, for as long as I can remember, I cleaned Frank's car. It started when the kids were little and left trails of crushed Cheerios and juice box spills across the back seat. Even after they left home, I maintained the habit. Frank would go to his men's breakfast at the diner, and I'd spend an hour vacuuming, wiping down surfaces, and making his Ford Explorer shine. He always thanked me with a kiss on the cheek and a "You're the best, Lucy," which made the chore worthwhile. It was the second Saturday in November when everything changed. The weather had turned cold overnight, and I was hurrying through my cleaning routine, eager to get back inside where it was warm. I had just finished vacuuming the front seats when I spotted something under the driver's seat. Thinking it was probably a pen or maybe loose change, I reached under to retrieve it. What I pulled out was a small tube of personal lubricant, not the kind you'd find at a drugstore for medical purposes. This was clearly designed for intimate encounters, with packaging promising heightened sensations and extended pleasure. I sat there in the driveway, the tube in my gloved hand, trying to make sense of it. Frank and I hadn't used such products in years. Our intimate life had dwindled to predictable monthly encounters that rarely required additional assistance. Besides, when we did need such things, they were kept in the bathroom drawer, not hidden in his car. There was really only one explanation, but I couldn't bring myself to accept it. Not Frank. Not my Frank, who taught Sunday school and volunteered at the food bank every Thanksgiving. Not the man who held my hand through 2 childbirths and nursed me through breast cancer 7 years ago. I slipped the tube into my pocket and finished cleaning the car, my movements mechanical, while my mind raced. When Frank returned from breakfast, I watched him carefully. Did he seem nervous? Was he checking to see if I'd been in his car? But he just gave me his usual peck on the cheek, mentioned that Bill Thompson was thinking of running for mayor, and settled in to watch college football. That night, I waited until Frank was in the shower before trying to check his phone. As expected, it required a 6-digit passcode I didn't know. I felt both ashamed for trying and angry that I needed to. Over the next few days, I began noticing things I'd previously overlooked. Credit card statements with charges at restaurants in Springfield on nights Frank claimed to be working late, a receipt for women's perfume tucked into his wallet behind his insurance license, the way he always took calls from the office in the garage or backyard out of my hearing. I needed to talk to someone before I lost my mind, so I called Patricia Miller, my best friend since junior high. We met for coffee at her house while her husband was at work. "You think Frank is having an affair?" she asked, her blue eyes wide with disbelief. Frank and Dave Miller had been best friends nearly as long as Patricia and I had. I showed her the lubricant tube, which I'd stored in a Ziploc bag like evidence at a crime scene. "This doesn't necessarily mean anything," she said, but her tone lacked conviction. "Maybe it's for, personal use." We both knew that wasn't likely. Frank wasn't the type. "You could hire someone," Patricia suggested reluctantly. Dave used a private investigator when he suspected his business partner was skimming from the company. The thought of paying a stranger to spy on my husband made me physically ill, but the alternative, continuing to pretend nothing was wrong while doubt ate away at me, seemed worse. In the end, I didn't need a professional. The following Thursday, Frank announced he had a late meeting with a potential client in Springfield and wouldn't be home until after 10. I waited 30 minutes after he left, then followed him in my car, feeling like a character in a bad television drama. Frank didn't drive to Springfield. Instead, he turned into the parking lot of the Oakview Motor Lodge, a dated motel on the edge of town that catered mostly to traveling salesmen and the occasional trucker. He parked his Explorer beside a red Mazda that I recognized with a sickening jolt. It belonged to Jessica Winters, the 28-year-old office manager Frank had hired last spring. I parked across the street at the gas station, watching as Jessica emerged from room 112, wearing a dress I could never fit into her blonde hair, cascading over bare shoulders despite the November chill. Frank got out of his car carrying what looked like a bottle of wine. When they embraced, his hand sliding down to grip her waist in a way he hadn't touched me in years, I felt something inside me crack. I didn't wait to see them enter the room together. I couldn't bear it. I drove home with tears streaming down my face, nearly missing a stop sign in my distracted state. At home, I poured myself a large glass of wine and sat in the dark living room surrounded by framed family photos that now seemed like artifacts from a fictional life. Frank came home at 10:30, looking relaxed and slightly rumpled. He claimed the meeting had gone well, that the client was considering a substantial policy upgrade. He kissed my forehead and asked if I'd recorded that baking show I liked, as if everything was normal, as if he hadn't just shattered 28 years of trust. I smiled and said yes, the show was recorded, ready for us to watch together. And in that moment, something hardened inside me. I wouldn't confront him yet, not until I knew exactly what I was dealing with. The following week was the hardest of my life. I went through the motions of normalcy, preparing Frank's favorite meals, asking about his day, even responding to his occasional physical advances, while conducting a thorough investigation of his betrayal. While he was at work, I searched our home office, finding receipts for jewelry I'd never received hidden inside his golf magazines. I discovered a prepaid credit card tucked inside his winter boots, with recent charges at the Oakview Motor Lodge every Thursday for the past 8 months. 8 months. While I was planning our anniversary dinner, he was planning regular rendezvous with a woman half my age. The most damning evidence came from our shared computer. Frank wasn't particularly tech-savvy and hadn't bothered clearing the browser history or logging out of his email. There, I found a second account I'd never known about under the username FreeSpirit57, a reference to his birth year and probably how Jessica made him feel free from the constraints of his middle-aged life and boring wife. The emails between them were graphic enough to make me blush, despite my 54 years and nearly 3 decades of marriage. Frank wrote things to her he'd never said to me, described fantasies I didn't know. He had made promises about their future that carefully avoided any mention of leaving his marriage. He was crafting the perfect arrangement for himself: respectability and stability at home, passion and excitement with Jessica. One message in particular haunted me. Jessica had written, "What about your wife? Doesn't she suspect anything?" Frank's reply, "Lucy, she trusts me completely. She'd never think I'd cheat. That's why this works so well." My complete trust, the thing I'd been most proud of in our relationship, was actually what made me the perfect victim in his eyes. I considered my options carefully. Confrontation would likely lead to denial, then tearful confession promises to end it, perhaps counseling. I'd seen this play out with other couples in town. The affairs usually resumed within months, just more carefully hidden. Divorce was financially daunting. After 28 years as a school librarian with modest retirement savings, Frank controlled most of our finances. Another truth I was now forced to face: I'd need a lawyer, which meant more money I didn't have readily available. I called my friend Susan Bradford, who divorced her philandering husband 3 years earlier. She now lived in an apartment above the pharmacy and worked 2 jobs to make ends meet. "Get copies of everything first," she advised. "Bank statements, retirement accounts, property deeds, and take half of any joint accounts before you tell him you know. Once you say the word divorce, he'll lock you out financially." It was practical advice that made the reality of my situation sink in further. This wasn't just about emotional betrayal. It was about my future security being at risk. Meanwhile, Frank grew increasingly careless. He left his phone unlocked on the kitchen counter one evening while showering. I saw texts from Jay about how much she missed last night and couldn't wait for Thursday. He came home with Jessica's distinctive perfume on his collar, claiming he'd helped a client who'd spilled her fragrance sample in his office. The worst came when I overheard a phone conversation Frank didn't realize I could hear. I'd gone to bed early with a headache, but came downstairs for water to find him on the back porch, speaking in hushed tones. "Baby, you know I can't just leave," he was saying. "It's complicated. Yes, I know what I promised. The timing isn't right. Of course I love you more, but marriage is about more than just love." He was stringing Jessica along with vague future promises while having no intention of disrupting his comfortable life. The realization that he planned to continue this indefinitely, perhaps for years, making a fool of me in our small town, where certainly others must suspect, was what finally broke my restraint. 2 Saturdays later, I was cleaning Frank's car again when I found the lubricant tube in the same spot under the driver's seat. It was nearly empty now, evidence of frequent use over the past weeks. Something inside me snapped as I held that small tube. All the pain, humiliation, and rage I'd been suppressing crystallized into a single thought: he shouldn't get away with this so easily. My first thoughts were admittedly extreme. I fantasized about posting their explicit emails on the church bulletin board or sending screenshots to everyone at his insurance agency. I imagined calling Jessica's parents, who still lived in town and had no idea their daughter was sleeping with a married man almost twice her age. But those actions would hurt me as much as them exposing my humiliation to the entire community. I needed something more targeted. The idea came when I was putting away cleaning supplies in the garage. On the workbench sat a tube of industrial-strength adhesive Frank had used last summer to repair a broken lawn chair. The tube was approximately the same size and shape as the lubricant. I picked it up, reading the warning label: creates permanent bond. Contact with skin may cause severe irritation. Not intended for internal use. A plan began forming. Outrageous, potentially dangerous, definitely wrong. I put the glue down and tried to dismiss the thought. I wasn't this person. I didn't do vengeful, malicious things. But that night, Frank claimed he was working late again, on a Saturday. He didn't even try to create a plausible lie anymore, so confident was he in my naivety. The next morning, I drove to the hardware store 2 towns over where nobody knew me. I purchased the strongest adhesive they carried, a contractor-grade product requiring special solvent to dissolve once cured. The elderly clerk raised his eyebrows when I insisted on this specific professional-grade product. "Must be a serious project, ma'am," he commented. "You have no idea," I replied. Back home, I carefully opened the lubricant tube and emptied its remaining contents. Using a small funnel, I filled it with the adhesive, which had a similar consistency but slightly different color. I added a tiny amount of lotion to match the exact shade, then sealed the tube and wiped it clean. To the casual observer, it looked identical to the original. As I worked, I battled my conscience. This could cause actual physical harm. It could have legal consequences for me. It was by any reasonable standard a terrible idea. Yet I thought about those emails about Lucy trusts me completely, about 8 months of lies while I cooked his meals and washed his clothes and believed his excuses. I thought about decades ahead of living this same deception if I did nothing. That Thursday, Frank announced his client meeting with the usual lack of concern for my suspicions. As soon as his car left the driveway, I went to the bedroom and retrieved the modified tube from its hiding place in my knitting basket. I walked to his car, used my key to unlock it, and placed the tube exactly where the original had been, partially visible under the driver's seat, as if it had rolled there accidentally. Then I went home, poured a glass of wine, and waited, alternating between satisfaction and panic. What had I done? Part of me hoped he wouldn't use it, that they'd skip their usual activities just this once. Another part, a darker part, I barely recognized, hoped for exactly the outcome I'd planned. Around 9 o'clock, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Springfield General Hospital. My heart nearly stopped. "Is this Mrs. Anderson, Lucille Anderson?" a professional female voice asked. "Yes, this is she," I answered, my mouth suddenly dry. "I'm calling regarding your husband, Frank Anderson. He's been admitted to the emergency room. He's stable, but asking for you." The drive to Springfield General was surreal. I fluctuated between concern that I'd gone too far and a grim satisfaction that my plan had worked. What exactly had happened? How badly was he hurt? Would he suspect my involvement at the hospital? A nurse directed me to a curtained area in the emergency department. Frank was lying on a gurney, a sheet pulled up to his chest, an IV in his arm. His face was ashen, eyes closed, but they flew open when I approached. "Lucy," he said hoarsely, then looked away, unable to meet my gaze. "What happened?" I asked, infusing my voice with innocent concern. A young doctor pulled me aside before Frank could answer. "Mrs. Anderson, your husband has experienced a sensitive injury." There was an adhesive involved causing tissue damage in the genital area. We've administered pain medication and are consulting with a urologist. Adhesive? I repeated wide-eyed. I don't understand. The doctor looked uncomfortable. It appears that during intimate activity, an industrial-grade adhesive was applied to sensitive tissues. Your husband and his companion required emergency services to separate them. I covered my mouth with my hand, the perfect picture of shock and confusion. Companion, I'm sorry, there must be some mistake. My husband was at a business meeting tonight. The doctor's discomfort increased visibly. I should let your husband explain. Just know that he'll recover, though there may be some residual skin damage. The firefighters did what they could at the scene. Firefighters, I whispered. They responded to the 911 call at the motel. Special solvents were required for the separation procedure. I nodded numbly and returned to Frank's bedside, my face carefully composed into an expression of wifely concern mingled with growing confusion. Before Frank could speak, a commotion erupted in the hallway. A woman's voice, young and strident, was demanding information about Frank Anderson. Jessica appeared around the curtain, her blonde hair disheveled, her face streaked with makeup, wearing what looked like hospital scrubs. She stopped short when she saw me. You? She said flatly. You? I echoed, allowing my confusion to transform convincingly into shock. Frank, who is this woman? What's going on? Jessica's eyes narrowed. Don't play innocent. You did this, didn't you? You swapped out the lubricant. The doctor just told me it was industrial glue. I have no idea what you're talking about, I replied steadily, turning to Frank. Honey, who is this woman, and why is she saying these terrible things? Frank looked absolutely miserable, trapped in a hospital bed between his wife and mistress, his genitals likely still burning from adhesive exposure. Lucy, he began weakly. I can explain. Oh, save it, Jessica snapped. Mrs. Anderson, your husband and I have been seeing each other for months. Tonight we were together at the Oak View when your little sabotage took effect. Do you have any idea how painful it was? They had to call a hazmat team. A nurse appeared, attracted by the raised voices. Ma'am, you need to keep your voice down. This is a hospital. This woman assaulted us. Jessica pointed at me dramatically. She put glue in a personal lubricant tube. That's premeditated harm. The nurse looked from Jessica to me to Frank, visibly connecting the dots of the situation. Her expression shifted from professional concern to poorly concealed amusement. Perhaps we should discuss this privately, she suggested, unsuccessfully hiding a smile. The entire floor doesn't need to hear about Mr. Anderson's predicament. Too late. By morning, the story of the insurance agent, his young girlfriend, and the glue incident would be circulating throughout the hospital and beyond. In our small-town ecosystem, such juicy gossip traveled at light speed. By lunchtime tomorrow, everyone in Oak Ridge would know that Frank Anderson had been rushed to the ER after being literally stuck inside his mistress, requiring firefighters with special solvents to separate them. As mortifying as the situation was for Frank and Jessica, I realized I felt no guilt, only a sense of justice served. Frank was discharged from the hospital around midnight with prescriptions for antibiotic, ointment, pain medication, and stern instructions about wound care for his affected areas. He didn't ask me to drive him home. In fact, he barely spoke to me at all, except to say he would be staying at a motel for a few days. Not the Oak View, I assume. I couldn't resist asking. He flinched and walked out of the hospital without answering. I drove home alone to an empty house that suddenly felt different, lighter somehow, as if a heavy fog had lifted. I slept better that night than I had in weeks without the weight of unspoken suspicions beside me. The next morning, my phone began ringing at 7. Patricia was first, her voice breathless with excitement. Lucy, is it true about Frank and that Jessica girl from his office and the glue? Word had spread even faster than I anticipated. I gave Patricia the official version, that I'd known nothing about the affair, had been called to the hospital without explanation, and was as shocked as anyone by what had transpired. But the glue, Patricia pressed. In the lubricant tube. That's the detail everyone's talking about. How would that happen accidentally? I really couldn't say. I replied, allowing her to draw her own conclusions. By noon, it seemed everyone in town had heard some version of the story. My sister Marlene called from Tulsa after a friend who still lived in Oak Ridge texted her. The school principal called to awkwardly offer personal leave during this difficult time. Even my dentist's office phoned ostensibly to confirm an upcoming cleaning, but clearly fishing for details. Frank didn't come home for 5 days. When he finally appeared to collect more clothes, he looked terrible, unshaven eyes, bloodshot shoulders slumped. The physical injuries were healing, the nurse had assured me, but his pride would take longer to recover. "We need to talk," he said, standing awkwardly in our bedroom doorway. "Yes, we do," I agreed, setting aside the novel I'd been reading. "About divorce." His face fell. "Lucy, it was a mistake. A stupid, meaningless fling that got out of hand." 8 months is not a fling, Frank. And the only thing that got out of hand was your assumption that I'd never discover the truth. "About the glue," he began carefully. "Did you—" I met his gaze steadily. "Did I, what Frank, replace your lubricant with adhesive? Why would I do that when I supposedly had no idea you were cheating, unless you're suggesting I somehow knew about your affair?" He had no answer for that. We both knew the truth, but he couldn't accuse me without admitting his infidelity first. It was a stalemate of sorts. "Jessica's transferred to the Carbondale office," he said finally. "It's over between us." "It's over between us too," I replied quietly. "I've consulted a divorce attorney. Papers will be ready next week." Frank's face reddened. "Because of one mistake, after 28 years. One mistake." I laughed without humor. "Frank, I found the emails. I know about the gifts, the motel meetings every Thursday for months. I know this wasn't your first affair, just the first time you got caught." His expression confirmed what I'd only suspected until that moment. There had been others before Jessica. How many years of our marriage had been a lie? "The kids will be devastated." He tried switching tactics. "Think about what this will do to them." "I already called them," I said. "Daniel and Emma are adults who deserve the truth. They're disappointed, especially about how public this has become, but they understand my decision." That wasn't entirely accurate. Daniel had been supportive, but Emma had argued that marriages hit rough patches and could recover with counseling. She didn't know all the details yet, and part of me wanted to protect her from the ugliness of it all. Frank left with a suitcase full of clothes and a warning. "People will think you did it, Lucy. The glue thing. It makes you look vindictive. And cheating on your wife of 28 years makes you look like what exactly?" I countered. Over the following weeks, I discovered that community opinion was surprisingly divided on the glue incident. While nobody condoned cheating, some thought my alleged revenge, which I neither confirmed nor denied, had been excessive, potentially dangerous. Others, particularly women, who'd been cheated on themselves, considered it poetic justice. What I hadn't anticipated was how Frank would try to leverage sympathy for his injury into painting himself as the victim. He told friends that my emotional distance had driven him to seek comfort elsewhere. He claimed I'd been obsessed with my job and uninterested in intimacy for years. He even suggested to our pastor that I might have mental health issues that needed addressing. But Frank's campaign for sympathy was undermined by an unexpected source, his male colleagues. At a Chamber of Commerce meeting, Dave Miller publicly refused to shake Frank's hand, saying, "I don't associate with men who betray their wives." The insurance agency's senior partner, who'd been like a father to Frank, removed his name from an upcoming promotion. And most devastating to Frank's reputation, 3 of his largest clients, all married women who handled their family insurance needs, transferred their policies to competitors. Meanwhile, I received quiet support from surprising places. Grocery store clerks slipped extra coupons into my bags. The librarian at the public branch set aside new releases she knew I'd enjoy. My neighbor Tom, a retired handyman, fixed my leaky kitchen faucet and refused payment. The most surprising revelation came when Janet Phillips, the wife of Frank's college friend Steve, invited me for coffee to talk about Frank. I expected recriminations. The Phillipses and Andersons had vacationed together for years. Instead, Janet confessed that Frank had made a pass at her during a couple's trip to Branson 3 years earlier. "I never told anyone because I was afraid Steve wouldn't believe me," she admitted. "Frank was so well respected and they'd been friends since college. But after what happened with Jessica, I thought you should know you're not the first." That conversation led to others. It seemed Frank had a pattern of targeting friends' wives, colleagues, sisters, even our former babysitter, who was now in her 30s. Most had rejected his advances, but not all. The image of my husband as a respected community pillar crumbled further with each new story. When our divorce attorney called a preliminary meeting, I arrived prepared for a fight. Instead, Frank was surprisingly amenable to my terms. The house would be mine, retirement accounts split equally, and he would provide reasonable alimony given the length of our marriage and the disparity in our incomes. "You're being unusually cooperative," my attorney noted suspiciously. Frank shrugged. "I just want this over with discreetly and quickly." We all knew discreetly was no longer possible, but I appreciated his cooperation nonetheless. Later, I learned from Patricia that Frank's new insurance clients were practically non-existent since the glue incident. His professional reputation, built over decades, had been destroyed overnight. The financial concessions in our divorce were partly pragmatic. He needed to resolve things before his income suffered further. As the paperwork proceeded, I began looking for my own apartment. The house held too many memories, and I wanted a fresh start. Emma was upset when I told her I planned to sell the family home eventually. "But where will we come for Christmas?" she asked suddenly, sounding like a little girl again. "Wherever I am will be home," I assured her. "We'll make new traditions." She was quiet for a moment, then asked the question she'd been avoiding. "Did you really put glue in Dad's, you know?" I considered my answer carefully. "What do you think, Emma?" "I think, sir," she said slowly, "that if you did, he deserved it. And if you didn't, it was one hell of a coincidence." We left it at that. Some things between mothers and daughters are better left in the realm of plausible deniability. 6 months after the glue incident, as it had come to be known throughout Oak Ridge, my life had transformed in ways I never imagined. I was living in a sunny one-bedroom apartment near the elementary school where I still worked. The divorce was finalized with terms favorable to me. Frank had been eager to conclude proceedings quickly and avoid court appearances that might generate more public attention. Jessica was long gone from his life. According to town gossip, which Patricia faithfully reported, she'd lasted barely a month at the Carbondale office before moving to Chicago for a fresh start. Frank had tried to reconnect with her after his injuries healed, but apparently the trauma of their emergency room experience had permanently dampened her enthusiasm for older married men. Frank himself had moved to Springfield, where the glue story was less well known, though internet local news had spread it further than we'd anticipated. He joined a different insurance agency at a significant pay cut and rarely visited Oak Ridge except for necessary business. When we did occasionally encounter each other at Daniel's birthday dinner or similar family events, he was cordial but distant, clearly still uncertain whether I had been responsible for his humiliation. I never confirmed or denied my involvement even to my closest friends. The uncertainty became part of my new mystique, the mild-mannered librarian who might or might not have executed the perfect revenge on her cheating husband. Young women at the library sometimes glanced at me with newfound respect. Men at community events were unfailingly polite, perhaps worrying about what creative retribution I might devise if crossed. The strangest outcome was my unexpected friendship with firefighter Luis Rodriguez, who had been part of the emergency response team at the motel that night. We met by chance at a community fundraiser where he recognized me immediately. "Mrs. Anderson," he'd said with a slight smile, "nice to see you in less complicated circumstances." Rather than being embarrassed, I found myself laughing. Luis was 38, divorced with 2 young daughters, and refreshingly direct. We began meeting for coffee occasionally, then dinners. It wasn't romance. The age gap and recent events made that impractical, but it was a friendship that helped me reconnect with the world as a single woman, rather than half of Frank and Lucy. My relationship with my children had evolved in unexpected ways too. Daniel, always practical like his father, had been surprisingly supportive. "Mom, I've suspected Dad was unfaithful for years," he confessed during a visit. There were signs even when I was in high school. Late night secret phone calls. I should have said something. "It wasn't your burden to carry," I assured him. Emma had struggled more with the divorce, having idealized her parents' marriage, but she was coming around, especially after Frank missed her birthday because he was on a cruise with a woman he'd met through an online dating site. "He's dating someone my age," she'd complained during our weekly phone call. "It's embarrassing." "Focus on your own life, sweetheart," I advised. "Your father's choices aren't a reflection on you." I took my own advice and focused on rebuilding my identity beyond being Frank's wife. I joined a women's hiking group that explored local trails each weekend. I enrolled in a community college course on digital photography, something I'd always wanted to learn. I redecorated my apartment in bright colors. Frank would have hated adopted an elderly cat from the shelter and started a small vegetable garden on my patio. Some days were still difficult. I'd catch myself reaching for the phone to tell Frank something funny that happened at work, or wake up confused by the empty space beside me. 28 years of marriage left muscle memory that took time to reprogram. The hardest moments were family events like Thanksgiving, when our fractured family structure became most apparent. For our first post-divorce holiday, I hosted dinner at my apartment for Daniel, Emma, and my sister Marlene. Frank had his own gathering with his brother's family. The kids split their time between us, an arrangement that felt like failure, until Emma pulled me aside to say, "This is actually nice, Mom. No tension, no walking on eggshells around Dad's moods." I realized then that our marriage had been deteriorating long before I found that tube of lubricant. We'd just become experts at ignoring the cracks in our foundation. One question continued to haunt me, though. Had my revenge been worth it? The public humiliation had certainly been satisfying in the moment, but it had complicated the divorce process, embarrassed my children, and cast me in a vengeful light among some community members. There were moments I regretted not handling things more maturely, confronting Frank directly instead of resorting to such a dramatic response. But then I'd remember his email to Jessica, "Lucy trusts me completely. She'd never think I'd cheat." I'd recall 28 years of devotion repaid with lies and betrayal. And I'd think of Frank and Jessica stuck together in that motel room, panicking as they realized what had happened, the embarrassment of emergency responders arriving to address their predicament. In those moments, regret faded completely. By the time my 55th birthday approached in April, I had created a life I genuinely enjoyed. My apartment felt like home. My job continued to bring satisfaction. My circle of friends had shifted. Some couples from our married life had drifted away, but new connections had formed primarily with other single women my age, navigating similar life transitions. Frank continued his efforts to rehabilitate his reputation and rebuild his client base in Springfield. According to Daniel, who occasionally had lunch with his father, Frank was dating actively, but struggling to form lasting relationships. Apparently, the glue incident had left emotional scars that surpassed the physical ones. "He asked about you," Daniel mentioned during our last phone call. "Wanted to know if you were seeing anyone." "What did you tell him?" I asked, curious despite myself. "I said you were too busy living your best life to worry about dating," Daniel replied. "That you seemed happier than you had in years." That was true. The woman who had cleaned her husband's car every Saturday for decades, who had overlooked suspicious behavior out of blind trust, who had defined herself primarily as Frank's wife, she was gone. In her place was someone stronger, more independent, and considerably less forgiving of disrespect. I still don't confirm or deny my role in the glue incident. Let Frank wonder. Let everyone wonder. There's power in that mystery in being underestimated and then proving dangerous when crossed. The mild-mannered school librarian, who may or may not have executed the perfect revenge, has become something of a local legend, especially among women who've been wronged by unfaithful partners. As for the moral of this story, perhaps it's that betrayal has consequences, sometimes unexpected and creative ones. Or maybe it's that 28 years of marriage doesn't entitle anyone to disrespect their partner. Or possibly, it's simply that librarians know where to find information on all sorts of useful topics, including industrial adhesives. What do you think? Was my alleged revenge justified, or did it cross a line? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story made you smile or validated your own feelings after betrayal, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about women reclaiming their power. Share this video with someone who might need a reminder that they deserve respect in their relationship. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember, sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one you should be most careful around.